The sound of her father's slurred voice bargaining over her like she was nothing more than a sack of grain made Margaret Nichols want to sink into the dusty floorboards of the saloon, but she stood frozen instead, her spine rigid with shame and fury. It was March of 1872 in Genoa, Nevada, and the mountain air still carried the bite of winter even as spring tried to push through. Margaret was 20 years old, and this was the third time in as many months that her father had attempted to sell her to whatever man had enough coin and desperation to take a bride without courting. The first time had been to a miner twice her age who reeked of sulfur and whiskey. Margaret had run to the sheriff who had dragged her back home with a lecture about honoring her father. The second time had been to a gambler passing through town, but the man had taken one look at the fire in her eyes and decided she was more trouble than she was worth. Now her father, Vernon Nichols, had his meaty hand wrapped around her upper arm as he spoke to a rancher from California who kept glancing at her like she was a horse he was considering purchasing. The rancher's breath smelled like tobacco and his eyes were cold as January creek water. "She can cook, clean, and she's strong enough for farm work," Vernon said, his words stumbling over each other. "I'm only asking $300. That is a fair price for a young, healthy woman." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. She tried to wrench her arm free, but Vernon's grip tightened until she knew there would be bruises blooming purple across her skin by morning. The saloon was crowded with men who pretended not to notice what was happening in the corner, though she caught a few glances of pity thrown her way. Pity did not help. Pity did not save her. "Does she talk much?" the rancher asked, squinting at her like she was not even there. "Not unless spoken to," Vernon lied. Margaret talked plenty when she had something to say, which was often. The rancher reached into his vest pocket, and Margaret knew he was going for his money. Panic seized her chest like a vice. She had nowhere to go. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her alone with a father who had drowned his grief in bottles and gambling debts. She had no siblings, no family to turn to. The few friends she had made in town were either too afraid of Vernon or too poor to help. That was when the cowboy spoke. "The lady is not for sale." The voice came from behind her, low and steady like distant thunder. Margaret twisted around as much as Vernon's grip would allow and saw a man standing near the bar. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn leather vest. His hat was pushed back enough that she could see dark hair and eyes that were a startling shade of green even in the dim lamplight of the saloon. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble and a calm, quiet confidence that made the entire room seem to shift its attention toward him. Vernon laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "Who the hell are you?" "Name is Harrison Rowland," the cowboy said, moving away from the bar with an easy grace that suggested he was comfortable with confrontation. "And I suggest you let go of her arm." "This is none of your business, Rowland," Vernon snarled. "She is my daughter, and I will do with her as I please." Harrison's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went hard. "No man has the right to sell another person. That includes you." The rancher from California backed up a step, clearly not interested in getting involved in whatever was about to happen. Other men in the saloon had stopped their conversations and were watching with the kind of attention people gave to a fuse burning toward dynamite. "I have debts to pay," Vernon said, shaking Margaret like she was a rag doll. "She is the only thing I have left to trade." "Then you should have thought of that before you gambled away everything you owned," Harrison said. His hand rested casually on his hip, not far from the revolver strapped to his side. It was not a threat, not exactly, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Margaret found her voice. "Please," she said, looking directly at Harrison, "help me." She did not know this man. She had never seen him before in her life. But there was something in his eyes that made her believe he might actually do what he said, that he might actually help her when no one else would. Harrison's gaze met hers for a long moment, and she saw his jaw tighten. Then he looked back at Vernon. "Let her go, now." Vernon's face turned an ugly shade of red. You cannot tell me what to do with my own daughter." "I just did." Harrison took another step forward. "And if you do not let her go, I am going to make you." The tension in the saloon stretched tight as a bowstring. Margaret could feel her father's hand trembling on her arm, though whether from anger or fear she could not tell. The rancher from California had disappeared entirely, probably slipping out the back door. Smart man. Vernon finally released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling forward. Harrison caught her easily, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. His touch was gentle, nothing like her father's bruising grip. "You will regret this, Riese," Vernon spat. "She is worthless anyway, nothing but a burden." The words stung, even though Margaret had heard variations of them her entire life. She felt Harrison's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder, a brief squeeze of reassurance. "Where do you live?" Harrison asked her quietly. "A mile outside town," she said. "A small cabin near the creek." He nodded. "Go there and pack whatever you need. I will deal with your father." She wanted to argue, to say that she could not just leave, that she had nowhere to go. But the look in Harrison's eyes told her that arguing would be pointless, so she did something she had never done before. She trusted a stranger. Margaret walked out of the saloon with her head held high, refusing to look back at her father. The evening air was cool and clean after the smoke and whiskey smell of the saloon. Her hands were shaking as she made her way down the main street of Genoa, past the general store and the hotel, and the small church where she had attended services every Sunday since she was a child. She wondered if she would ever see this town again. The walk to the cabin felt longer than it ever had before. By the time she reached the rickety front porch, the sun was setting behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She went inside and looked around at the place she had called home for 20 years. It was not much. A single room with 2 beds, a table, a stove, and a few shelves holding their meager possessions. Her mother's quilt was folded at the foot of Margaret's bed, the only thing of value she owned. She did not have much to pack. A few dresses, her mother's quilt, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and a book of poetry that had belonged to her mother. She rolled everything into a bundle and tied it with twine. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and waited. She did not have to wait long. She heard hoofbeats outside and looked out the window to see Harrison riding up on a dark bay horse. He dismounted and tied the horse to the porch rail, then knocked on the door. Margaret opened it before he could knock a second time. "Is my father coming after me?" "No," Harrison said. "He will not bother you again?" She wanted to ask what he had done, what he had said to make Vernon give up so easily, but she was afraid of the answer. So instead she asked, "Where am I supposed to go?" Harrison removed his hat and held it in his hands. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered from time spent outdoors, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It is not much, but it is clean and safe. You can stay there until you figure out what you want to do next." "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked. "You do not even know me." Harrison was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "My mother was sold by her father when she was 18, he finally said, "to a man who treated her worse than he treated his livestock. She managed to run away after a year, and she met my father not long after. But she never forgot what it felt like to be treated like property. She made me promise that if I ever saw someone in a similar situation, I would help if I could. So that is what I am doing." Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "I am sorry about your mother." "She is doing well now," Harrison said. "Living in Oregon with my father and my younger sister, but thank you." She picked up her bundle. "I do not have any money to pay you." "I am not asking for payment, Germer," Harrison said. "I am offering you a safe place to stay, that is all." Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some kind of trap, but all she saw was sincerity. "All right," she said, "I will come with you." They rode through the gathering darkness, Margaret sitting behind Harrison on his horse with her bundle clutched against her chest. The trail north led through pine forests and open meadows following the curve of the mountains. The night was cold enough that she was grateful for the warmth of Harrison's back in front of her, though she tried not to think too much about how close they were sitting. Harrison did not talk much as they rode, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one. Occasionally he would point out a landmark or warn her about a rough patch of trail, but otherwise he seemed content to let the sounds of the night fill the space between them. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. It was fully dark by the time they reached the ranch. Margaret could not see much in the moonlight, but she got an impression of a decent-sized house, a barn, and several fenced pastures. Harrison helped her down from the horse and led her inside while he took care of the animal. The house was simple but well-maintained. The main room had a fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, and a couch that had seen better days but looked comfortable. There were 2 doors leading off the main room, which she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was neat and clean, which surprised her. Most men living alone tended to let things pile up. Harrison came in a few minutes later and immediately went to the fireplace to start a fire. "You must be hungry," he said. "I can make something simple if you want." "I can cook," Margaret offered, "if you show me where things are." He looked at her with a small smile. "You do not have to earn your keep, you know. You are a guest." "I know," she said, "but I would like to help. It will make me feel less like a charity case." Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fair enough, the kitchen supplies are in those cabinets, and there is a cold box outside with meat and vegetables." They worked together to make a simple meal of fried potatoes and salt pork. It was not fancy, but it was hot and filling, and Margaret realized she had not eaten since breakfast. They sat at the table and ate in companionable silence. "Tell me about your ranch," Margaret said eventually. Harrison wiped his mouth with a napkin. "I bought this place 2 years ago with money I saved from working cattle drives. It is small, just 30 acres, but I'm building it up slowly. I have about 20 head of cattle right now, a few horses and some chickens. I do odd jobs around town when I need extra money. It is not much, but it is mine." "It sounds nice," Margaret said honestly, "to have something that is yours." "What about you?" Harrison asked. "What do you want to do with your life?" No one had ever asked her that before. Margaret sat back in her chair, surprised by the question. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have spent so long just trying to survive that I never thought about what I actually wanted. I suppose I would like to feel safe. And maybe have a garden. I've always wanted to grow flowers." "There is plenty of space for a garden here," Harrison said. "You could plant whatever you like." They talked for a while longer, sharing small pieces of their lives. Harrison told her about growing up in California, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the cattle drives that had taken him from Mexico to Montana. Margaret told him about her mother, about the happy years before the illness that had taken her, about the books she loved to read and the poems she sometimes wrote in secret. It was late by the time they finished cleaning up from dinner. Harrison showed her to the spare bedroom, which had a simple bed with a patchwork quilt and a dresser with a cracked mirror. "It is not much," he said, "but the bed is comfortable and the door locks from the inside." The fact that he mentioned the lock made Margaret's opinion of him rise even higher. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Harrison nodded, his green eyes serious in the lamplight. "Get some rest. We can figure out the details tomorrow." Margaret slept better that night than she had in months. The bed was comfortable. The room was warm from the fire in the main room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. When she woke in the morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and she could hear Harrison moving around in the main room. She dressed quickly and went out to find him making coffee at the stove. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "I did," she said, "better than I have in a long time." He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "I need to ride into town today to pick up some supplies. You are welcome to come with me if you want, or you can stay here, whatever makes you comfortable." Margaret thought about it. The idea of going back to Genoa so soon made her stomach twist with anxiety. What if she ran into her father? What if people stared at her and whispered? But at the same time, she did not want to hide away like she had done something wrong. I will come with you, she decided. I cannot hide forever. Harrison smiled at her, and she noticed that it made the lines around his eyes deepen. That is the spirit. They rode into town a few hours later, arriving just before noon. Margaret sat up straight on the horse behind Harrison, determined not to show any fear or shame. A few people did stare as they rode down the main street, but Harrison ignored them completely, and Margaret tried to do the same. They stopped at the general store first. The owner, Mr. Chen, was a Chinese immigrant who had run the store for as long as Margaret could remember. He looked surprised to see her with Harrison, but did not comment on it. Harrison bought flour, sugar, coffee, and various other supplies, paying with coins from a leather pouch he kept in his vest. As they were leaving the store, Margaret heard someone call her name. She turned to see Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women in town she considered a friend. Sarah hurried over, her face concerned. "Margaret, are you all right?" Sarah asked, glancing between her and Harrison. "I heard what happened at the saloon last night. Everyone is talking about it." "I am fine," Margaret said. "Better than fine, actually. This is Harrison Rowland. He has been kind enough to offer me a place to stay." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "It is good to meet you, Mr. Rowland. Thank you for helping Margaret." "Just doing what is right," Harrison said quietly. Sarah turned back to Margaret. "If you need anything, you know where to find me. I mean it." "Thank you," Margaret said, feeling a rush of warmth toward her friend. It was good to know she had not been entirely abandoned by everyone in town. They made a few more stops before heading back to the ranch. As they were riding out of town, Margaret saw her father standing outside the saloon. Vernon stared at her with bloodshot eyes, his face twisted with anger. But he did not approach them, did not say anything. Harrison rode past him without even acknowledging his existence, and Margaret felt a fierce satisfaction at the sight. Over the next few weeks, Margaret settled into life at the ranch. Harrison was true to his word about letting her do whatever she wanted. Some days she helped him with chores around the property, other days she spent time reading or starting plans for the garden she wanted to plant. Harrison was easy to live with, quiet but not distant, helpful but not overbearing. He treated her with a respect she had never experienced from a man before. They fell into a comfortable routine. Harrison would wake before dawn to tend to the animals, and Margaret would make breakfast. They would work together on various projects during the day, then share dinner in the evening. Sometimes they would talk for hours after the meal was done, sharing stories and opinions and dreams. Other times they would sit in companionable silence, both reading by the fire. Margaret found herself watching Harrison when he did not know she was looking. She noticed the way he was always patient with the animals, the way he would sometimes hum quietly to himself while he worked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She noticed how strong he was, how he could lift heavy bags of feed like they weighed nothing, but how gentle his hands were when he helped a newborn calf or repaired a broken fence. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. There was something warm in his gaze, something that made her heart beat a little faster. One morning in early April, Margaret woke to find the world transformed. Spring had finally pushed winter aside, and wildflowers were blooming across the meadows. The air smelled sweet and fresh, and birds were singing in the pine trees. She dressed quickly and went outside to find Harrison already at work repairing a section of fence. "It is beautiful," she said, coming to stand beside him. "It is," he agreed, hammering a nail into place. "Best time of year, in my opinion." "I want to start my garden today," Margaret said. "Would you help me choose a spot?" Harrison set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his pants. "I would be happy to." They walked around the property together, discussing the merits of various locations. Finally, they settled on a spot near the house that got plenty of sun, but was close enough to the well that watering would not be too difficult. Harrison spent the rest of the morning helping her turn the soil and mark out rows. As they worked side by side, Margaret felt something shift inside her. She had been at the ranch for almost a month now, and it was starting to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like home. She glanced at Harrison, who was focused on breaking up clods of dirt with a hoe, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. She was falling for him. The realization should have scared her, but instead it felt right, natural, like it was something that had been building since the moment he had stood up for her in the saloon. "Harrison," she said quietly. He looked up, pushing his hat back. "Yeah? Thank you. For all of this. For everything." He smiled at her, and her heart did a strange flip in her chest. "You do not need to keep thanking me, Margaret. I am glad you are here." "So am I," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. As spring deepened into early summer, their relationship shifted in small but significant ways. Harrison would sometimes reach out to brush a strand of hair from her face. Margaret would find excuses to stand close to him while they worked. They would catch each other's eyes across the dinner table and smile for no reason at all. One evening in late May, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Harrison finally said what had been building between them for weeks. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "What is it?" He took off his hat and set it on the porch beside him, then turned to face her fully. "I know you came here because you needed help, and I want you to know that my offer of a safe place to stay still stands no matter what. But I need to be honest with you. I have feelings for you. Strong feelings, and I have had them for a while now." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "Harrison?" "You do not have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I just wanted you to know. I do not expect anything from you. I will never pressure you or make you feel like you owe me something because I helped you. But I care about you, Margaret, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His skin was warm and calloused from work, and his hand engulfed hers completely. "I have feelings for you too," she said softly. "I have been trying not to because I did not want to make things complicated, but I cannot help it. You are the kindest, most decent man I have ever met, and I think about you all the time." Harrison's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger. "Really?" "Really," she confirmed, smiling back at him. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "May I court you properly, then? I want to do this right." "Yes," Margaret said, feeling like she might burst from happiness. "I would like that very much." Harrison courted her with a sweetness that made her fall even deeper in love with him. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow. He taught her to ride one of his gentler horses. He took her on picnics by the creek, where they would spend hours talking and laughing. He kissed her for the first time under a sky full of stars, and it was the most perfect moment of Margaret's entire life. As the summer progressed, Margaret's garden flourished. She planted vegetables and herbs, but also flowers, daisies and black-eyed Susans and columbine that attracted hummingbirds. She loved spending time there in the early morning, when the dew was still on the leaves and the world felt fresh and new. Harrison had expanded his cattle herd and was making good progress on the ranch. He talked about his plans for the future, about building a bigger barn, about maybe buying the adjacent property if it ever came up for sale. And increasingly, those plans included Margaret. One afternoon in July, Margaret was in town buying seeds when she ran into her father. Vernon was stumbling out of the saloon, clearly drunk even though it was barely past noon. He saw her and his face twisted with anger. "There you are," he slurred, lurching toward her. "You think you're too good for your own father now, living in sin with that cowboy?" Margaret felt her spine stiffen. She was not the scared girl she had been 3 months ago. "I am not living in sin with anyone. And even if I were, it would still be better than living with you." Vernon raised his hand as if to strike her, but before he could move, Harrison appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He grabbed Vernon's wrist and held it in an iron grip. "Do not even think about it," Harrison said, his voice deadly calm. Vernon tried to pull away, but Harrison held firm. "She is my daughter," Vernon protested weakly. "She is not your property," Harrison said. "And if you ever try to hurt her again, you will have to deal with me. Do you understand?" Vernon mumbled something incoherent, and Harrison released him with a look of disgust. Vernon stumbled away, and Harrison turned to Margaret with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Thank you for being here." "Always," Harrison said simply. That night, after they had returned to the ranch and eaten dinner, Harrison asked Margaret to come outside with him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. He led her to a spot near her garden where he had set up 2 chairs. "Sit with me?" he asked. She sat, wondering what this was about. Harrison seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. He kept fidgeting with his hat, turning it over in his hands. "Margaret," he finally said, "I know we have only known each other for a few months, but they have been the best months of my life. You make me laugh. You challenge me. You make this house feel like a home, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He set down his hat and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. Margaret's heart started racing as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "This was my grandmother's ring," Harrison said. "My mother gave it to me years ago and told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Margaret Nichols, will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. 6 months ago, she had been trapped in a nightmare with no hope of escape, and now this wonderful, kind, amazing man was asking her to be his wife. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply. Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all of her love and gratitude and joy into that single moment. They were married in early August in the small church in Genoa. Sarah Mitchell stood up as Margaret's witness, and Harrison's friend Tom from a neighboring ranch served as his. It was a simple ceremony, but Margaret had never been happier. She wore a dress that Sarah had helped her make, pale blue with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Harrison wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Margaret could hardly believe he was really hers. Vernon did not attend the wedding. Margaret had not invited him, and as far as she knew, he had left Genoa entirely. Some people said he had gone to California to try his luck in the goldfields. Others said he had drunk himself to death in a saloon in Carson City. Margaret did not particularly care. She had made peace with the fact that her father had been a deeply flawed man who had never truly loved her. She could not change the past, but she could build a better future. And that was exactly what she did. The first year of their marriage was one of hard work and deep happiness. Margaret learned everything she could about running a ranch, from caring for cattle to managing the household finances. Harrison treated her as a true partner, asking for her opinions and valuing her input. Together they made the ranch more successful than it had ever been. In the spring of 1873, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. Harrison was beside himself with joy, immediately insisting that she should not do any heavy work, and fussing over her constantly. Margaret found it both annoying and endearing. "I am pregnant, not broken," she would tell him, laughing. "I know," he would say, "but I want to take care of you. Let me take care of you." She had never had someone who wanted to take care of her before, so she allowed it more than she probably would have otherwise. Their son was born in November. Healthy and loud and perfect, they named him Henry, after Harrison's father. Margaret had never known she could love someone so completely, so instantly. Watching Harrison hold their tiny son for the first time, seeing the wonder and love on his face, she fell in love with her husband all over again. As Henry grew from a baby into a toddler, Margaret and Harrison talked about expanding their family further. In 1875, they welcomed a daughter they named Rose, after Margaret's mother, whose real name had been Rosemary. Rose was quieter than Henry had been, with her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes. Life was not always easy. There were hard years when the cattle prices dropped, when droughts threatened the ranch, when illness swept through the animals. But Margaret and Harrison faced every challenge together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the good ones. In 1878, they were able to buy the adjacent property, doubling the size of their ranch. Harrison built a larger barn and expanded the cattle operation. Margaret's garden had grown to include a small orchard, and she had started selling her extra produce at the market in town. They had a third child in 1879, another son they named Michael. And in 1882, they welcomed their youngest, a daughter named Lily. Their house had been expanded twice by then, with enough bedrooms for all the children and a large dining room where they could all gather for meals. Margaret's friendship with Sarah Mitchell had deepened over the years. Sarah had married a banker from Carson City and had 3 children of her own. The 2 women would get together regularly, their children playing while they talked and laughed. "You seem happy," Sarah said to Margaret one afternoon in the summer of 1885 as they sat on Margaret's porch watching their children play in the yard. "I am," Margaret said simply. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "You deserve it," Sarah said. "After everything you went through with your father, you deserve every bit of happiness you have found." Margaret thought about those dark days 13 years ago when she had believed her life was over, that she would never escape her father's control. She thought about Harrison standing up for her in that saloon, about the kindness he had shown her, about the love they had built together. "I am lucky," she said softly, "lucky that Harrison was there that night, lucky that he was the kind of man who would help a stranger." "It was not just luck," Sarah said. "You were brave enough to accept his help. You were strong enough to start over, and you have worked hard to build this life. Give yourself some credit." Margaret smiled. "All right, I am lucky and brave and strong." "That is better," Sarah said with a laugh. That evening, after the children were in bed, Margaret and Harrison sat on the porch together as they often did. It was their time, these quiet moments at the end of the day when they could just be together. "Do you remember the night we met?" Margaret asked. Harrison took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. "Of course I do. You were the bravest person in that saloon, standing there with your head held high even though you were terrified." "I was not feeling very brave," Margaret admitted. "I was feeling desperate." "Bravery and desperation often look the same," Harrison said. "The important thing is that you did not give up. You asked for help, even though you had no reason to trust me." "I saw something in your eyes," Margaret said. "Something that told me you were different from other men, that you actually meant what you said." Harrison lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Best decision I ever made, helping you that night." "Best decision I ever made, accepting your help," Margaret replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. The stars were brilliant overhead, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "For what?" "For making sure there was no 4th attempt. For giving me a life I never dreamed I could have. For loving me." Harrison pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you for letting me love you, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a home and a reason to wake up smiling every morning." Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, feeling completely content. She thought about the girl she had been, trapped and hopeless, believing she had no value beyond what men were willing to pay for her, and she thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and free. Her father had tried to sell her 3 times, but Harrison had made sure there was no 4th attempt. He had not just saved her that night in the saloon. He had shown her what real love looked like, what partnership meant, what it felt like to be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. Their children would grow up knowing they were loved, knowing they had value, knowing they could choose their own paths in life, and that was the greatest gift Margaret could imagine. As the summer of 1885 faded into fall, the ranch continued to thrive. Henry, now 11 years old, was already showing an interest in the cattle business. He would follow his father around, asking endless questions about breeding and marketing and range management. Harrison was patient with him, answering every question and teaching him everything he could. Rose, at 10 years old, had inherited her mother's love of growing things. She spent hours in the garden with Margaret, learning to identify plants and understand what they needed to flourish. She had a gentle way with animals too and had claimed one of the barn cats as her special pet. Michael, at 6, was the wild child of the family. He was always climbing trees, chasing chickens, and getting into trouble, but he had a sweet heart. And when he was not causing chaos, he could be found curled up with a book or playing with his baby sister. Lily, at 3, was the darling of the family. She had her father wrapped around her tiny finger and knew it, but she was not spoiled thanks to Margaret's firm but loving guidance. She was learning her letters and numbers and loved to help her mother with simple tasks around the house. One afternoon in October, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Harrison was out checking fences, so Margaret went to greet the visitor. The man was elderly, well-dressed, and riding a fine horse. "Good afternoon," Margaret said politely. Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Vernon Nichols," the man said. "I was told his daughter lived here." Margaret felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "Vernon Nichols is not here. I've not seen him in over 10 years. The man nodded slowly. "I see. I am Samuel Wright, an attorney from San Francisco. I'm afraid I have some news about your father. He passed away 3 weeks ago in Sacramento." Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, guilt for feeling relieved. "How did he die?" "Pneumonia," Mr. Wright said. "He had been living in a boarding house, working odd jobs. When he died, the landlady found my card among his possessions. He had come to me several years ago to draw up a will." "A will?" Margaret was surprised. "He had nothing when I last saw him?" "He did not have much when he died either," Mr. Wright admitted. "But he did have one thing: a small parcel of land outside Sacramento, about 10 acres. It was given to him in payment for some work he did. According to his will, he left it to you." Margaret did not know what to say. After everything her father had done to her, after trying to sell her 3 times, after the years of neglect and abuse, he had left her his only asset. "I do not know if I want it," she said honestly. Mr. Wright handed her an envelope. "These are the documents. You do not have to decide right away, but if you want to claim the land or sell it, these papers will allow you to do so. I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Rowland." After he left, Margaret sat on the porch steps with the envelope in her hands. She was still sitting there when Harrison rode up an hour later. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, dismounting and coming to sit beside her. She told him about the visitor, about her father's death, about the land. Harrison listened quietly, his hand resting on her back in silent support. "How do you feel?" he asked when she finished. "I do not know," Margaret said. "I thought I would feel more when he died. Relief, maybe, or even satisfaction. But I just feel empty. He was my father, but he was never really a father, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," Harrison said. "He left me land," Margaret continued. "After trying to sell me like I was livestock, after everything he did, he left me something in his will. I do not understand it." Harrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Maybe it was his way of trying to apologize. Maybe in the end he realized what he had done was wrong, and this was the only way he knew to make amends. Or maybe he just did not have anyone else to leave it to, Margaret said. "Maybe," Harrison agreed. "Does it matter?" Margaret thought about it. "No, I suppose it does not. He is gone, and nothing I do now will change what happened in the past. What do you want to do with the land?" She looked at her husband, at his honest face and kind eyes. "I want to sell it, and I want to use the money to start a fund to help other women who are in situations like I was. Women who need to escape, who need a safe place to go, who need help starting over." Harrison smiled at her, pride evident in his expression. "That is a wonderful idea." Over the next few months, Margaret worked with Mr. Wright to sell the land. It brought in a modest sum, enough to start the fund she had envisioned. She worked with Sarah and several other women in town to establish a network of support for women in desperate situations. They found safe houses, arranged transportation, and helped women find work or training. It was not much, but it was something. And every woman they helped, Margaret thought about that night in the saloon when Harrison had stood up for her. She wanted to give other women the same chance she had been given. As the years passed, the fund grew. People donated money and time. The network expanded to other towns in Nevada and even into California. Margaret became known throughout the region for her work, though she always insisted that she was just one person doing what she could. In 1890, Henry went off to agricultural college in California, determined to learn modern ranching techniques to bring back to the family operation. He wrote long letters home, full of enthusiasm and ideas. Margaret saved every letter, proud of the man her son was becoming. Rose, at 15, was courting a young man from a neighboring ranch. Margaret liked him well enough, but she made sure Rose understood that she had choices, that she did not have to marry if she did not want to, that her value was not determined by any man. "I know, Mama," Rose would say with a smile. "You have told me 100 times." "I will tell you 100 more," Margaret would reply. "I never want you to forget it." Michael and Lily were still at home, causing their usual chaos and joy. The house was never quiet, never boring, never empty. Margaret loved it. In the summer of 1892, Margaret and Harrison celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county. There was food and music and dancing, and Margaret felt surrounded by love. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone home, Harrison took Margaret's hand and led her away from the house, down to the creek where they had gone on their first picnic all those years ago. 20 years, he said, pulling her close. "Has it been everything you hoped for?" "It has been better," Margaret said, resting her head against his chest. "I did not even know I could hope for something this good. You gave me more than a home, Harrison. You gave me a life, a real life." "You gave me the same thing," Harrison said. "Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, building a ranch, making money, but not really living. You made everything mean something." They stood there by the creek, holding each other as the stars came out overhead. The water burbled over the rocks, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called. It was peaceful and perfect, and Margaret wished she could freeze this moment forever. But life moved on, as it always did. Henry graduated from college and returned home to work the ranch with his father. He brought new ideas and energy, and the operation flourished under their combined management. In 1894, he married a school teacher from Carson City named Emma, and they built a house on the far end of the property. Rose married her young man in 1895, in a beautiful ceremony that made Margaret cry. They moved to a ranch about 20 miles away, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have their own independence. Margaret made sure Rose knew she would always have a home to return to if she needed it, though she hoped Rose would never find herself in a situation like Margaret had been in. Michael, who had inherited his father's way with horses, decided to start a horse breeding operation. Harrison gave him a section of land and helped him build the necessary facilities. By 1897, Michael's horses were becoming known throughout Nevada for their quality and temperament. Lily, the baby of the family, surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to become a doctor. It was an unusual ambition for a woman, but Margaret and Harrison supported her completely. They sent her east to attend medical school, and though it was hard to have her so far away, they were incredibly proud of her determination. In 1898, Margaret turned 46 years old. She looked at herself in the mirror one morning and was surprised by the woman looking back at her. There was gray in her dark hair now and lines around her eyes and mouth. But she looked happy, content, loved. She thought about the 20-year-old girl who had stood in that saloon, terrified and desperate, believing her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that she would not just survive but thrive, that she would find love and build a family and make a difference in the world. But maybe that girl would not have believed her. Maybe some things you just had to live through to understand. Harrison found her standing at the mirror, and he came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The past," she said. "How different my life could have been." "But it was not different," Harrison said. "It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Hard at first, yes, but look at what we have built. Look at what you have become." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. He was 50 now, with silver threaded through his dark hair and deeper lines in his face. But his green eyes were the same as they had been the night she met him, full of kindness and strength. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough, but I love you so much, Harrison Rowland." "I love you too," he said, kissing her softly. "Every single day, I love you more." They stood there in their bedroom holding each other, two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something bright and lasting. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. In 1900, Margaret and Harrison became grandparents for the first time when Rose had a daughter. They named her Margaret after her grandmother, and Margaret cried when she held her tiny namesake for the first time. Henry and Emma had 3 children in quick succession, filling their house with noise and laughter. Michael married a rancher's daughter from California, and they started their family shortly after. Even Lily, busy with her medical studies, found time to fall in love with a fellow doctor, though she insisted she would not marry until after she completed her training. Margaret's work helping women in desperate situations continued to grow. By 1902, the network she had helped establish had safe houses in a dozen towns and had helped hundreds of women escape dangerous situations. She received letters regularly from women thanking her, telling her how her help had changed their lives. Each letter made her think of Harrison and how his single act of courage had changed hers. In the spring of 1905, Margaret was in her garden when she noticed Harrison moving more slowly than usual. He had been complaining of being tired lately, which was unlike him. When she asked if he was feeling all right, he waved off her concern. "Just getting old," he said with a smile. 57 is not as young as 27. But Margaret insisted he see a doctor. After a thorough examination, the doctor told them that Harrison's heart was weakening. He needed to slow down, avoid strenuous work, and take better care of himself. Harrison was frustrated by the restrictions, but Margaret was firm. "We have 4 children and 8 grandchildren," she told him. "They need you around for a long time yet, so you're going to listen to the doctor." Henry and Michael took over more of the ranch work, allowing Harrison to step back to a supervisory role. It was hard for him at first, but he adjusted. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, telling them stories about the old days. Margaret and Harrison had always been close, but these years drew them even closer. They spent long evenings on the porch, talking about their life together, remembering the good times, and laughing about the bad ones. They held hands like newlyweds and still kissed each other goodnight every single evening. In 1908, they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. All 4 of their children came home with their families, filling the ranch with noise and chaos and love. There was a huge dinner with 3 generations gathered around tables set up in the yard. As Margaret looked around at all the faces, at the family she and Harrison had created, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. After dinner, after the children had been put to bed and the adults were sitting around talking, Harrison stood up and tapped his glass for attention. "I want to say something, Mignon," he announced. Everyone quieted down, turning to look at him. 36 years ago, I married the most amazing woman I have ever met. Margaret has been my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. She has made me a better man than I ever would have been without her, and I want everyone here to know how grateful I am for every single day we have had together." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Harrison came over and pulled her to her feet, holding her close. "I love you," he whispered in her ear, "more than anything in this world." "I love you too," she whispered back. Their children and grandchildren erupted in applause. And then Henry proposed a toast. "To Margaret and Harrison, who showed all of us what real love looks like." Everyone raised their glasses, and Margaret felt her heart might burst from happiness. But happiness, as Margaret well knew, was always tinged with the awareness that nothing lasted forever. In the fall of 1910, Harrison's health took a turn for the worse. He developed a bad cough that would not go away, and he grew weaker by the day. The doctor came regularly, but there was little he could do. Harrison faced his declining health with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. He made sure all his affairs were in order, talked to each of his children about the ranch and their futures, and spent as much time as he could with Margaret. One evening in late October, as they sat together on the porch wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, Harrison took Margaret's hand. "I need you to know something," he said softly. "What is it?" Margaret asked, though she had a feeling she knew what was coming. "I need you to know that these past 38 years have been the greatest gift of my life. Meeting you, loving you, building this life with you. I would not change a single moment of it." Margaret squeezed his hand tightly. "I would not change anything either. You saved my life that night in the saloon, Harrison. And every day since then, you have continued to save it by showing me what love and respect and partnership really mean." "Promise me something," Harrison said. "Anything. Promise me you will not stop living after I am gone. You have so much more to give, so much more to do. Keep helping those women. Keep tending your garden. Keep being the amazing person you are." "I promise," Margaret said, though the words felt like they were being ripped from her chest. "But you are not going anywhere for a long time yet." Harrison smiled at her, but they both knew the truth. He died 3 weeks later, in his sleep, with Margaret holding his hand. He was 59 years old. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county. People came from all over to pay their respects to a man who had been known for his integrity, his kindness, and his unwavering devotion to his family. Margaret stood between her children, accepting condolences in a daze, barely able to believe that Harrison was really gone. The first few months without him were the hardest of Margaret's life. She would wake up reaching for him, only to remember he was not there. She would start to tell him something, then realize he would never hear it. The house felt empty even when it was full of family, but she had made him a promise, and she intended to keep it. Margaret threw herself into her work helping women. She expanded the network even further, working with churches and civic organizations to establish more safe houses and support systems. She traveled around Nevada giving talks about the importance of protecting vulnerable women and children. She became a voice for those who had no voice, just as Harrison had been a voice for her all those years ago in that saloon. Her children worried about her, but they also understood that the work was helping her heal. And slowly, as the months turned into years, the sharp pain of grief softened into a dull ache that she could live with. In 1915, on what would have been their 43rd wedding anniversary, Margaret stood at Harrison's grave with a bouquet of wildflowers from her garden. "I miss you," she said quietly. "Every single day I miss you. But I want you to know that I have kept my promise. I am still living, still helping, still being the person you helped me become. Our children are all doing well. We have 14 grandchildren now, can you believe it? And Lily just wrote to tell me she is going to have her first baby. You would be so proud of all of them." She set the flowers on the grave and stood for a moment, remembering the night they met, when he had stood up for a desperate stranger, remembering the kindness he had shown her, the love he had given her, the life they had built together. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For making sure there was no fourth attempt, for giving me a chance at a real life, for loving me." A breeze rustled through the trees, and Margaret smiled. She liked to think it was Harrison's way of answering her. Margaret lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71 in 1927. She had lived to see all 4 of her children happily married, to meet 23 grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. She had helped establish a statewide network that had assisted over 1,000 women escape dangerous situations. She had tended her garden every spring, had kept Harrison's memory alive through her stories, and had never once regretted the decision to trust a stranger in a saloon on that March night in 1872. At her funeral, Henry stood up to speak about his mother. He told the story that everyone knew but never grew tired of hearing, about how his father had stood up to a drunk trying to sell his own daughter, about how Harrison had offered Margaret safety and respect and eventually love. About how two people had met in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful that lasted the rest of their lives. My father used to say that the best decision he ever made was helping my mother that night, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. But my mother always said the best decision she made was accepting his help. I think they were both right. They saved each other. And in doing so, they gave all of us the greatest gift imaginable. They showed us what love really looks like. The entire church murmured their agreement. Rose and Michael and Lily sat in the front row with their families, crying quietly. Around them were the women Margaret had helped over the years, some who had traveled hundreds of miles to be there. They knew what Margaret had meant when she said that everyone deserved a chance at a real life because she had lived it herself. Margaret was buried next to Harrison on the ranch they had built together. The property had been divided among their 4 children, but they all still lived there, still worked the land, still tended Margaret's garden that bloomed faithfully every spring. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the sun was setting behind the mountains and the air smelled sweet with wildflowers, the grandchildren would ask their parents to tell them the story again. The story of how their grandmother had been saved by their grandfather, how he had stood up when no one else would, how he had made sure there was no 4th attempt. It was a story of courage and kindness and love that had started in a smoky saloon in Genoa, Nevada in 1872 and had echoed through generations. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for someone who cannot stand up for themselves. That one act of courage can change not just one life, but hundreds. And that love, real love, can grow even in the darkest of places as long as you are brave enough to reach for it.